Hello and welcome back to another chat. I'm Justin. I help out with MHV's channels on occasion and I've appeared as a guest in the past. I have an MA in history from the University of Calgary, but it's enough about me. So joining me today is Trent Hone. He's the author of Learning War, The Evolution of Fighting Doctrine in the U.S. Navy, 1898 to 1945. So welcome, Trent.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
So is there anything else you'd like to add additionally about your professional background?
Sure. I try to balance effectively two different careers. I'm a naval historian and I'm also a management consultant. I've been working in the software development and IT industry for a little over 25 years now. And one of the things that was really enjoyable about learning war and about the process of putting it together is I got to marry those two interests. The career that I have as a day job and sort of the side job of naval history combined the two in an effort to try to draw out a better understanding of what the United States Navy was doing in the first half of the 20th century and how it was learning, particularly through the lens of its surface warfare doctrine.
Fascinating. So Trent has actually appeared on the channel before. It was been a year or maybe a little bit longer ago, where he talked specifically about the CIC. Today we'll be talking about something different, but also somewhat related, and that is the United States Navy's night fighting capability, spanning way back before the Second World War and then through the Second World War. And I guess to start off, we can kind of briefly discuss the conventional narrative of U.S. Navy night fighting in World War II, which I would kind of sum up. Well, a lot of words get thrown out like neglected, or the U.S. Navy was unprepared, or you know, not a lot of detail, just that it just gives off the impression that the US Navy had either completely ignored it before the war, or if they were paying any attention to it whatsoever, it really wasn't very a focus. And my read on your work is that it doesn't completely overturn the notion that the US Navy struggled in night fighting initially, but it adds far, far more detail than I've seen elsewhere about the exact hows and whys. You correct the narrative in very specific areas.
Thank you for that. I take that as a compliment. That was one of the things that I was trying very hard to do. Correct the narrative is kind of a strong term, but to add more understanding to it, add a little bit more nuance. I think there are some valid reasons why that is the standard narrative, why that's come down to us. And I was trying to put that into context. So, where does that narrative come from? Why are certain elements of it justified? But also, what is it missing? And I think one of the key things that it's missing is how much work was done before World War II to try to get the United States Navy effective at night combat, at night tactics, but it was all framed in a way that was oriented towards the understanding of what a campaign in the Pacific was going to look like in the interwar period, which is not how the fighting turned out, and it also is aligned much more toward the fleet organization that the United States Navy planned to employ during the war, which is not what it was able to use. And so some of the reasons why we have heard terms like unprepared or unsophisticated have to do with what preparation did happen and how it was misaligned to how the war actually developed and the nature of the fighting that took place. And I'm sure we're going to get into that.
Yeah, so I guess to start, how far back was the U.S. Navy seriously grappling with night fighting? Because I think one of the strengths of your book is that it goes back further than other studies, which tend to start maybe in the interwar years. A lot of the stuff specifically on U.S. night fighting, a lot of them just start with World War II. Um, so how far back does this go in U.S. Navy thinking?
It goes quite a ways back, and I think it's really important to do that. I'm glad you're asking this question because one of the things that I noticed is that in the immediate pre World War II period, there is a bit of a dip in terms of the sophistication and quality of the Navy's training and preparation for night fighting, and I believe a lot of that has to do with the rapid expansion of the fleet on the eve of the Second World War. So if you look back in the interwar period, things are a bit more sophisticated earlier in the interwar period. But you're right, I go back even farther. And I think I would really trace the beginning of sophisticated night combat tactics and doctrine in the U.S. Navy to the pre-World War I period, or at least the before the American entry into that conflict. And a lot of good work was done in the Atlantic Fleet's torpedo flotilla. The Atlantic Fleet, as I explained in the book, is really it's created in 1907, and it's the first forum where the United States Navy has an opportunity to practice modern tactics with large numbers of ships. Prior to that, the fleet had been distributed around the world in squadrons and other formations that didn't allow that. So this is the first chance that the U.S. Navy has to begin to explore how to fight as a modern fleet. Night tactics were part of that, but they really start to flourish when William S. Sims becomes commander of the Atlantic Fleet Torpedo Flotilla in 1913. And he starts exploring with doctrine as developed by Dudley Knox at the Naval War College immediately before joining the flotilla. And they start working out how to ensure cohesion in combat in the absence of specific instructions or real-time communications. And that's what the Navy at that time saw as doctrine. And so Sims's work in this area is very influential. He begins to experiment with something called the night search and attack, which is how you would use destroyers to search for an enemy formation, penetrate it, and then attack the large ships at the heart of it. And they do this. They're doing this before the American entry into World War One, and some of the tactics, at least from my read, were pretty sophisticated for the time.
How much did the US Navy's thinking about night fighting change in the interwar years? Like, how did they conceptualize what a night battle would look like? And did their thinking in the interwar years kind of pass through any distinct phases? Or was there a great deal of continuity from the 1920s through the 1930s?
I think it'd be appropriate to think of it as two phases. So, in the immediate aftermath of World War One, the Navy exits that conflict. Sims goes on to be commander of American naval forces in European waters, and he spreads this concept of doctrine that he had developed in the Atlantic Fleet, exposes a lot more officers to it, particularly destroyer officers or others who are involved in the campaign against the German U-boats. And so the immediate post World War I period is an opportunity that the Navy tries to seize on to codify what's been learned about tactics and doctrine, particularly for destroyers. And the first official doctrinal manuals of the United States Navy are issued during this time. And what continues, at least with night tactics, is this idea that destroyers, being relatively small, not being very effective gun platforms, are a weapon of stealth to be used at night to approach quietly, unseen, and fire torpedoes. And this is what you see in the exercises and tactics of the period. Now, as time goes on through the interwar period, this changes a little bit because there are new ship types that are being added to the fleet. The heavy cruisers begin to get introduced. And so screening capabilities become more sophisticated. A large formation of ships, a fleet, can screen itself more effectively at night. It becomes more difficult for destroyers to penetrate that formation in a stealthy way, in an unseen way, and close the range and attack with torpedoes. So to combat these more sophisticated screening tactics, some of the heavy cruisers, quite logically, because some of them are part of the scouting fleet, begin to get associated with and operate with the destroyers in these night search and attack operations. And they start to use their guns as a mechanism for creating a hole in an enemy screen to allow the destroyers to penetrate and make their torpedo attack. And as new destroyers begin to join the fleet with 5-inch dual purpose guns, they become more effective gun platforms as well. And so the tactics shift in the interwar period from small destroyers that are a stealthy weapon to be used or to attack unseen to we're going to shoot our way into an enemy formation and then fight our way to a position where we can launch torpedoes at enemy heavy ships, battleships, carriers, or other large combatants. And so this is what I was alluding to earlier about the nature of the war that the United States Navy wanted to fight. They were anticipating this large fleet action. They were anticipating that they would have to penetrate an enemy formation to attack at night with torpedoes. And so the shift away from stealthy tactics that might have worked well at night to firing guns first, using those to get to the enemy formation, and then attacking with torpedoes. This is something that happens because of how the United States Navy was thinking about a war in the Pacific, and it's reflected in terms of the exercises that they went through, like the large fleet problems, which I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with. They I don't want to say encouraged. That's probably too strong a word, but they sort of nudged the United States Navy in this direction because a lot of those sought to create a large fleet action to provide training and exercise in that kind of combat, and so that became the orientation of American naval officers. We'll fight a large fleet action, and before that, or immediately after that, there will be this night search and attack where we have to penetrate an enemy screen.
Yeah, I found that very interesting when I was reading your book because I'm a little bit more familiar with the Japanese Navy side of things. I was largely ignorant of what the US Navy was thinking before the war. Um, and there's certain parallels that I found interesting, like on the Japanese side, the gradual, because initially it was all the destroyers. That was what was going to fight at night with their light cruiser flagships.
Mm-hmm.
Then they realized when the cruisers come along, um, initially the treaty cruisers or heavy cruisers, they would be used in daylight scouting and that kind of role. But again, they were confronting almost a near exact the exact same problem, just in reverse, as they were anticipating they're going to need to punch through a very heavy American screen at night to get to the battleships, and the light cruisers and the destroyers themselves don't have what it takes. We need to start thinking about integrating the heavy cruisers into night combat. And then I think it was 1934, if memory serves, they had taken that to probably even further than the U.S. Navy ever did, where they were integrating the Kongo class battle cruisers or reconstructed battleships into their night formations. And as Evans and Peaty point out, it was kind of strange because the way their instructions were written, the heavy ships were supposed to smash through and almost recklessly, like sacrifice themselves so the destroyers, these small ships that are generally regarded as expendable, could break into the formation and launch more effective torpedo attacks. It was an interesting, it's not identical, but it's just an interesting how two navies are thinking about solving a problem that is very similar, and they're coming up with solutions that are not completely alien to one another.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. You're right. I obviously had that in mind when I was going through this because Evans and Peaty wrote Kaigun a good bit before I wrote Learning War. But it's really interesting to see how the two navies, confronted with a similar problem, are have sort of this paralleled evolution. And I do think it's interesting, this idea of the heavy ships sacrificing themselves to allow the destroyers to get closer. Um, I think the Japanese approach, from what I understand it, I am less familiar with primary sources on that side, but is a bit more sophisticated and flexible because of the capabilities that the Japanese weapons had, particularly the torpedoes. But still very interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting I'd say in some areas it was overcomplicated,
Yeah.
which is a common criticism that gets leveled against the Japanese Navy. But just reading some descriptions of what they thought was going to play out, and we're going to launch torpedoes from here, we're going to have another flank, and then they're going to launch torpedoes, and we're going to launch this massive coordinated attack along the entire. And I'm just thinking, at night with minimal to no radio communication and nothing but like aircraft to spot, I'm like, this is very wishful thinking. Uh, but yeah, it's just interesting to see those parallels. And I guess we've kind of covered this a little bit, but what kind of blind spots were present in the U.S. Navy's assumptions of night combat in the interwar years?
Yeah, we have covered this a little bit, but there is an important aspect here that I want to reemphasize or point out, and the the tactical development, the doctrine developed in the United States Navy in the interwar period is primarily focused, or at least the doctrines at the fleet level are focused at what they call major action. A large fleet action, a large battle that's going to culminate in a battle line action, A lot of things orient towards that. Then the what they call minor tactics. This would be so if you've got a detached force with some cruisers and destroyers, and if they encounter the enemy and fight a battle, that would be minor tactics. Those tactics received much less attention at the fleet level because they were intended to be variable. They wanted to allow local commanders to develop contextually sensitive approaches. So, develop a plan that reflects the strengths of the ships that you have and their capabilities and their nature, and then execute that plan. Now, this works pretty well if you have enough time to practice together, to get familiar with your subordinates and the capabilities of their ships, and put that kind of a plan together. And with a fleet organization that is relatively stable, as it was before the war, this is not necessarily a bad idea. But then when war comes, that stability of the fleet has to be abandoned as ships get damaged, as task forces get reconfigured, and as the United States Navy tries to fight both in the Atlantic and the Pacific simultaneously. And so the assumption that you would be able to allow more junior commanders to develop tactics and doctrines for their forces, that they would have time to do that, uh, was invalid. And you see the consequences of that in the Solomons, particularly off Guadalcanal.
Yeah, so now that we brought up Guadalcanal, and we've kind of, I think, established that the U.S. Navy had not ignored this problem before the war or even before the First World War. They had been thinking about this a long time. There were certain area gaps in their, or blind spots, you could say, in their thinking. But now, as we move into the Second World War, their first, I shouldn't say their first, because the first, one of the first night actions they actually fight with the Japanese occurs during the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, where the U.S. Navy actually performs extremely well. um, I think it's Balikpapan,
Yes,
if I
valuable
remember right.
ban. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Exactly. And just to since we're on it, that's an example of that pre-war approach working, right? So those the old destroyers of the Asiatic fleet had trained together. They'd worked together. They knew each other, so they could execute a battle plan um, pretty easily because they had that cohesion from working together before, and that's what's missing at Guadalcanal.
Yeah, I initially I didn't have that engagement in my notes, but I think it is important to note, which is why I wanted to bring it up again. I remember reading a really good quote actually from Richard Frank's Tower of Skulls about it, but I'm not going to try and misquote it because I don't have it written down in front of me. But yeah, it was, for those that maybe are totally unfamiliar with this. It was small. It didn't throw the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies into the trash or anything like that. But it was a significant win for the U.S. Navy, and it kind of demonstrates that the ships that had been working together, and with they also had surprise on their side, which is very significant. We'll get into that a little bit later. Can perform extremely well. It's not just that every single U.S. Navy formation was always hopeless at combat. So I guess moving to Guadalcanal, these are the engagements that are perhaps the most famous. So your chapter in your book, in the book on Guadalcanal, is titled "Heuristics at Guadalcanal," and what do you mean by that?
Heuristics are a shortcut for decision making. It's something you develop over time and with experience. And the idea is to sort of free up mental capacity for other things. A lot of us use heuristics all the time, although we may not use that word very often. One example that I like to use is for when we're driving. It's called the 3 second rule. Now, I'm sure a lot of us don't adhere to this. Certainly, where I live near Washington, D.C., most drivers don't adhere to this. But the idea is that you would maintain a 3 second gap between the car in front of you and your own. And the nice thing about this is you can just sort of apply it without having to think a lot about how fast you're going, because obviously as you go faster, you cover space better or faster. So you just leave 3 seconds between spaces between cars, and then you that frees up mental energy to do other things, like perhaps adjust that because of road conditions, or keep out for, an eye out for the next exit that you're trying to get off at, or maybe where you have to buy gas or something like that. So a heuristic is a habit in a way that we develop over time that we use to make complex decisions faster and easier. So it can sort of channel your thinking. And I argue in the book that before the Second World War, the United States Navy developed three heuristics, or at least we can see three heuristics in their patterns of behavior when it comes to tactical actions. The first one is aggressive action. So the Navy stressed very much. We want to try to gain the upper hand as quickly as possible, and we can do that by being aggressive, trying to take the initiative, seize control of an action. The second one, and here I'm borrowing terms from retired Captain Wayne Hughes, attack effectively first. So the best way to act aggressively and to try to seize the initiative is to attack and attack effectively. Obviously, you're not going to open fire at ranges beyond which your guns can reach, but one of the reasons the Navy was emphasizing long range fire in the interwar period was to try to gain an initial advantage, perhaps interfere with an enemy battleship deployment. And then the final one is decentralized decision making. And this gets back to the point I was making about minor tactics before. The Navy was trying to leverage the creativity of its officer corps. So let's not specify what the minor tactics should be. Let's provide some sort of guidelines and then allow officers to come up with plans in a decentralized way that reflect the capability of the forces they happen to have with them at the time. So this was in battle, it's decentralized decision making and execution. But then, as far as doctrinal development, that's also decentralized a good bit. And when things start to break down off Guadalcanal in terms of the cohesion of formations and units, the United States Navy has to bring together what has been described in a wide variety of different writing as scratch teams or pickup teams, ships that haven't worked together before. They very quickly, when combat begins, fall back on these patterns of behavior that had been learned through exercises in the interwar period. So, they fall back to using their guns quite often, trying to, act aggressively, attack effectively first. Certain destroyers will, go off and try to close the range with an enemy formation, even if no one is following them, because they're trying to act aggressively, take control of the situation. And you see a good deal of this. In some battles, those approaches are enough to give the United States Navy a victory. In others, not so much. But you can see it. You can see these patterns not just through the pre-war exercises, but also in these battles as well. So I tried to emphasize that when discussing the history of Guadalcanal, particularly from a tactics and doctrinal standpoint.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because anyone who's more familiar with the details of the battles, like now that you've talked through these three pillars, I think they're readily apparent in all of those actions. And just you can see them falling back on these simple. I mean, it's going back to the car analogy, the 3 second rule. We don't all operate cars together in big car problems, and we all just practice the three set. It's something that exists outside of this, out of like a box that you need to train with other people for,
Mm.
um, that you can like rely on when other things break down. Um, so obviously, the Guadalcanal campaign doesn't start well for the U.S. Navy. Perhaps most infamously, one of the most infamous engagements, probably of the Pacific War, the Battle of Savo Island, results in the sinking of 4 Allied cruisers. Sometimes this will be attributed just to, again, the U.S. Navy was unprepared for night actions, and that is why they lost the battle. Do you think that's an oversimplification? Were there other factors that were more important in this defeat?
I do think that's an oversimplification, especially if we say, well, the United States Navy is unprepared for night combat. We just talked about the example of Balikpapan, which suggests that in some ways they were. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about Savo, which has spawned and deserves books of its own, is there's a lot that you can get into in terms of what went wrong or what happened. One of I'll list a number of things that I think were extremely important. One was the faith placed in the radar picket destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot. The screening disposition really relies on them being able to detect any approaching Japanese surface forces with their radars, and it doesn't work. Right? There's too much clutter from land masses and other backgrounds, or perhaps the operators were too fatigued, but they don't detect the Japanese at all as they approach. So without that warning, there's no opportunity for the northern and southern Allied cruiser groups to form into a single cohesive formation before the Japanese arrive, which was the intention. The dispositions are problematic. So you've got a northern force, a southern force. There's a western force that doesn't get involved in the battle, but the intent was to be able to bring them together. But if they're surprised, there's no time. And also, one of the things that I think is quite interesting and informative, there was a lot of concern about Japanese submarines. I think with good reason. So if you look at the specific formations that those cruiser groups are in and where the destroyers are arranged relative to them, they're primed to try to detect and then fight off a night submarine attack. That doesn't happen. So they're not terribly well arranged or oriented to fight off the Japanese ships when they show up, the cruisers and the destroyers. And the commander of the Allied screen, Rear Admiral Crutchley, isn't there. So there's an interesting a thing that I would like to know more about sometime, and I've heard some people who are looking into this, so I hope they draw it out, is with Savo, you also have to get into different assumptions about how the Royal Navy is going to approach tactics and how the U.S. Navy is, because Crutchley has a background in the Royal Navy, and his approach to issuing orders and instructions appears, from what I've been able to gather, different from how the United States Navy would approach it. So it's likely there's some difference of opinion there that feeds into this. But regardless, he is also absent, takes his cruiser Australia away from the screen so he can confer with Turner to understand how best to continue the offloading of the transports the next day. And they're all tired as well. All the Allied commanders have been enduring air attacks for 2 days, lots of long watches. And I think many of them are assuming that this evening is a time when they'll have a little bit of downtime. Um, and they're not ready when the Japanese arrive. So Vice Admiral Mikawa leads his ships into Savo Sound, and he achieves surprise, which in these night battles is really decisive. The ranges are very short. The weapons of the day are extremely lethal at these ranges, and if the Japanese cruisers have a chance to line up torpedo fire control solutions and gunnery fire control solutions before you have a chance to know they're there, that is pretty much it. So the Southern force is dispatched very quickly, and then the Northern force hesitates because they're not sure that the cruisers that are approaching them are actually the enemy. And so they lose what little time they have to be more prepared because of the disposition, and they don't know that the Japanese are about to be upon them. And that's it. So a whole series of things, not minor exactly, but a whole series of events fall together to make it a crippling and crushing defeat. And I think Makawa deserves a lot of credit for being opportunistic and taking advantage of every flaw that the Allies make leading up to and in that battle.
Yeah, and just to, I guess we're not going to go battle by battle, so I guess I'll mention to drive home this surprise point in particular, is that in the very next engagement, the tables are turned as far as surprise is concerned, and the Americans achieve surprise, and they end up winning. Now there's nuance and subtlety to that, but ultimately the surprise is like a very significant factor. I mean, Admiral Goto, he's confused throughout the entire action. I mean, he just kept, I think it was, he kept calling people around him idiots because he pretty much even after he was mortally wounded and all that, he never fully understood, at least during the action, from what we can piece together, that he was under attack by U.S. ships. He thought it was a horrible friendly fire incident. So Aoba was getting pummeled by the U.S. Navy, and it was constantly signaling "I am Aoba," trying to get them to stop shooting at it. Um, so that kind of drives the point home that the surprise is so significant. I mean, it's significant in all sorts of circumstances, but definitely in these night engagements at very, very close ranges, when they're going to be confused at the best of times. It can be absolutely decisive.
Yeah, that there's 2 points in there, and you finish with the second one. I mean, surprise is absolutely decisive, but the confusion also, and that recurs in these. And one of the frustrations that I've had sometimes in going through or assessing accounts of these night battles is it's very easy, 70 some years on, in the comfort of an office or living room, to feel like the battles made a lot more sense and were a lot easier to understand than they actually were. And if you go through the action reports, sometimes you get a strong sense, particularly when you try to compare two or three together, of just how different it looked to different participants who are, had different points of view. These were very confusing battles and very fast paced.
So instead of going through kind of battle by battle, I guess we'll talk a little bit about probably the most famous bit of technology around these night battles, which is the role of radar. So during these actions off Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy had radar for the most part. The Japanese Navy did not. Um, what was the role of radar in these engagements, and how is the U.S. Navy attempting to integrate its use into their tactics, and how successful did they end up being in these various actions?
Mm. Radar is very important. And one of the things that I think gets too little attention is how the specific capabilities of these radars and influence the actions. One thing that I think needs to be stressed is that the U.S. Navy had essentially two development tracks for radar. There were search radars, which were the responsibility of the Bureau of Ships, and then there were fire control radars that were developed by the Bureau of Ordnance. They share technologies, but the radars were developed for different purposes, and that influences the capabilities as well as how they're used. One of the reasons Savo was so important is before the war, there's a lot of faith placed in radar. It performs well in exercises. It's easy to detect approaching enemy ships uh, because it's not trialed very extensively in littoral environments like off Guadalcanal. So when the SC radars, which are the sort of one of the earlier models of search radars, fail to detect the approaching Japanese before Savo Island, all of a sudden now faith in the radar, which had been fairly well grounded or fairly solid, is undermined. And so, yikes! We thought this technology was going to work. It doesn't work. What does that mean? And so, Rear Admiral Scott, we alluded to Cape Esperance, which was the next battle a little bit ago. His flagship cruiser San Francisco has an SC radar before that battle, but he turns it off because he doesn't think it's going to be very effective. And he's also worried that the Japanese may have some capability to detect its signals. The radars that were much more effective in that battle and many of the others were the fire control radars, the FC and the FD. Sometimes these are known as the Mark III and Mark IV, depending on what source you're reading. Both they more or less mean the same thing, but these are the ones from the Bureau of Ordnance. The FC is for surface fire control. You find it on cruisers and battleships. The FD is a dual purpose set that is primarily on destroyers or in the secondary armament of battleships, and they're accurate enough that particularly with ranges, that you don't need visual ranges to open fire and develop a fairly accurate fire control solution. But what you do need, because their bearing discrimination isn't terribly good, you do have to be able to see the target. You have to get the bearing from visual sightings. So even though radar augments the tactics and the capabilities of American ships, it's not enough to allow them to fire blindly without being able to see the target. Although some ships try to do that. South Dakota, for example, in the fight in November 1942, tries to fire using radar fire control alone, and she isn't very accurate. Battleship Washington, who is in the same fight, employs a more effective procedure, radar ranges, visual bearings, and is extremely accurate. So when the radars and their capabilities are understood, when you have a solid crew who understands these, the radars can be very influential, at least in terms of how accurate the guns are and bringing the guns on target. Now, a problem is, though, these radars that I've mentioned, the SC, the FC, and FD, they all use something that was called an A scope, which essentially is an oscilloscope. And around the horizontal axis is range, the vertical axis is the strength of a return. So if you use the FC radar, this is pretty good. You can narrow it in on a fairly narrow range band and see the target there. You can also see shell splashes, particularly if the shells are sizable, like 6 inch or up. And so you can get a sense of, are the shells around the range of the target, and you can use it to enhance your fire control solution and even spotting to a certain degree. The problem is that because you can see the shell splashes, and because you have brought it down into a narrow range band, it was very easy for radar operators to become confused as to where the target was relative to the splashing shells. So there were many instances where an American cruiser is following a target and observing the shells, observing the radar return from the target, and then losing the target because it changes direction quickly or goes out of that narrow range band that the observer is looking at. And this was very common if they were tracking a Japanese destroyer that changed direction quickly after launching torpedoes. And so you'll see in the records a lot of accounts of very significant claims of enemy ships sunk by U.S. Navy ships from night battles, because when they stopped firing, there would be no target within the radar display because it had changed direction, was now many hundreds of yards or miles away, and that's it. Well, it's gone. It's sunk because we were tracking it on our radar. But what they actually ended up doing was tracking their own shell splashes. The SC radar had a similar A scope, which made it very difficult for SC radar equipped ships to develop effective situational awareness, because effectively the SC radar could be either developing a target, what is its range, what is its bearing, or it could be searching for other targets. You really needed a plot to make sense of the information that an SC could provide you, and you also needed a skilled team to know when to sort of try to develop a target more precisely and when to continue scanning. The radar that changes this, the search radar that changes this, is the SG, which has the PPI, or plan position indicator display, which is what we all think of when we think of a radar. Right? It's the top-down bird's eye view, the radar's at the center, and then pips are around the outside. And because the PPI allows the radar to continue to sweep, and meanwhile we see the pips slowly fading, the targets or the contacts that have been observed by the returning signals, you could get much better situational awareness. You still needed a plot to understand how courses were changing and ships were changing direction, but just by looking at a PPI display, you get a sense of what is going on, where are different radar returns, where are different ships, which ones are friendly, which ones are enemy. And it was much easier for ships that had SGs to maintain situational awareness and understand what was going on in some of these fights. So I've given you kind of a lengthy explanation, but I think it's important to understand the capabilities of the radars and how they influenced not just the abilities of U.S. Navy ships, but also how officers would, using the capability of these sensors, make sense of or struggle to make sense of what was going on around them.
Maybe somewhat related to radar. Radar was one aspect of this. But speaking more generally, was the U.S. Navy effective at quickly analyzing the results of the battles and then internalizing and disseminating the lessons learned? Um, and then, if so, why end kind of this Guadalcanal campaign with one final defeat at the hands of the Japanese.
This is something that I found really interesting. Once I had to go back and look at the records of the 20s and 30s, and then re-examine what I was seeing in action reports and other things from the Guadalcanal battles to, I think, really understand how lessons from one fight were being carried into the next. And one of the keys was recognizing that, there's so much responsibility on these lower level commanders to develop their own tactics and doctrine for their forces. I hadn't really appreciated that the first time I went through action reports from the Guadalcanal battles. But with that background, I recognize that there's clearly an attempt to make sense of what happens in prior battles and take them into the next, at least in certain fights, right? So one of the problems at Savo is the formation is too distributed. The risk of friendly fire or fratricide causes hesitation. So Rear Admiral Norman Scott, before Cape Esperance, he is responsible for this surface action group in the South Pacific, and he develops a very concentrated formation. He puts it in a line, so it's a little easier to maneuver. And he puts destroyers at either end of the cruiser line that's in the center because he wants to be able to fight to either flank very quickly in case the Japanese appear from an unanticipated direction. It's even called a double header formation in certain documentation. And that to me is really interesting. It's an obvious reaction. Things we tried at Savo didn't work. Let's do something else. And it's different. It's different from how the Navy was thinking about night combat before the war. So Scott is departing from some lessons in order to try to make the most of what has been learned in wartime. And it works at Cape Esperance largely because the Japanese are surprised, as we talked about earlier. So Rear Admiral Callahan uses a similar formation going into the night action on the 13th November. And there it doesn't work well at all. The line is too long, it's unwieldy, and it's just a melee. It's a very confused night action. So after that, although I don't think Rear Admiral Lee had a whole lot of opportunity to make sense of what happened on the 13th, but a couple nights later, in his action with the two American battleships, he adopts a different formation. So he keeps the battleships together and uses his four destroyers, who haven't had much opportunity to work together, kind of as an advanced screen to try to flesh out the Japanese and develop targets. The destroyers are roughly handled, but to some degree it works. The destroyers do mix it up with Japanese fleet forces and give some space to the battleships, or at least to Washington, to make sense of what the Japanese are trying to do and to be able to respond to it. Then we get to Tassafaronga. And here, Admiral Kincaid develops a battle plan that reflects the lessons that have been learned so far. So he's now assumed responsibility for the South Pacific's Surface Action Group, or at least one of them. Halsey removes him from command of the carrier group, and he invests some time in trying to understand. Okay, this is the way these actions are developing, and here's what we can do. And he thinks that the best approach is going to be holding the cruisers back beyond about 10,000 yards from the enemy, and sending the destroyers ahead, getting them in position for a radar-assisted torpedo attack using an SG radar-equipped destroyer in the van, and loose the destroyer attack first so that the cruisers don't open fire until about the time torpedoes are expected to arrive in the Japanese formation. Sounds great on paper, but Kincaid leaves the South Pacific before the battle starts. Rear Admiral Wright is put in command of the force. He lacks the same degree of familiarity with his subordinates and with the plan. So when the opportunity comes to allow the destroyers to make their radar-assisted attack against the Japanese formation, he hesitates. That you could make an argument that Commander Cole, who's the commanding officer of the destroyer Fletcher, leading that formation, should not have asked permission or should have just said, I am attacking. Well, he didn't do that. Gave Wright the opportunity to tell him whether or not he should. Wright said no. And by the time Cole is given approval to attack, the Japanese are no longer in position. Wright opens fire with his cruisers very quickly, and they get a good deal closer than 10,000 yards to the Japanese destroyers. But it probably wouldn't have mattered much anyway, because 10,000 yards isn't far enough. The Japanese had shifted tactics as well. So now they're coming to Iron Bottom Sound not with a mixed group of cruisers and destroyers. There's no battleship. Instead, it's just a destroyer group that are very well practiced at using their torpedoes in a stealthy attack. They execute it very well. And so this final defeat is, I think, reflective of a shift. Both navies are adapting, and the U.S. Navy has decided to try to emphasize the gun power of its cruisers. The Imperial Japanese Navy is emphasizing the torpedo power of its destroyers, and that is a better match for the Japanese. Now, probably should say that a lot of commentators have said that Tassafaronga is a repeat of the linear tactics that Scott and Callahan used, and that's really not the case. There are destroyers that rear the formation, but they were just added there because it was thought that Wright might be able to find a use for them. They weren't part of the battle plan, and they were parked at the rear of the formation to make sure that they didn't interfere with the plan that had been developed. So it's not the same approach, and I think that explains pretty well not just Tassafaronga, but what happens in some of the battles the next year.
So I guess to sum up the U.S. Navy's actions off Guadalcanal, what weaknesses kind of did these actions expose in the U.S. Navy, and then how did the U.S. Navy ultimately win?
This is one of the keys of the book. I think the coming to grips with the Japanese, with a very capable opponent that's fighting in ways that the United States Navy didn't anticipate, is essential to understanding how the U.S. Navy's doctrine and tactics evolved over the course of the war. So not only is there learning, in the theater, battle to battle, like I was just describing, but there's also learning at this next level, at the fleet level, what can be done about some of the problems, some of the mistaken assumptions that are being exposed and the fighting. And so two things come out of it. One is the need for a better way to make sense of what's happening in these fights. Radar provides a lot of information, but it's not being used. And formation commanders and ship captains are being overwhelmed with trying to sort through all these things in their own brains. And so the Combat Information Center emerges. This is something that Admiral Nimitz directed in November 1942, sort of at the climax or at the height of the campaign. And I think his instructions in this regard are really interesting because he doesn't. It's a fairly short set of instructions that issue the creation of it, and he explains the outcomes that the Combat Information Center should be able to achieve, but it doesn't explain how ships should achieve those outcomes. Basically, he leaves it up to them. He fosters this parallel experimentation, which is very interesting. And then the other thing that happens is there's a recognition that the pre-war assumption that minor tactics can be left to lower level commanders is wrong. Right? We do not have the kinds of cohesion in formation and fleet organization that we were anticipating. We've got to move plans and doctrinal development up a level. More work has to be done at the fleet level to give these small, sometimes ad hoc formations an ability to work together more effectively. And that leads to a new doctrinal manual, PAC-10, Pacific Fleet Current Orders or Current Tactical Orders and Doctrine, which is issued in June 1943. And those two things begin to help the United States Navy work through not just how to fight more effectively at night, but also how to organize more effectively for the kind of war that had to be fought in the Pacific. And I think the winning at Guadalcanal is tied to a recognition, and it's fascinating to me how Nimitz develops this insight and then promulgates it in trips to the South Pacific and elsewhere. That really the decisive moment in the Pacific War at that time is the fighting, is the campaign at Guadalcanal. That's where the U.S. Navy and the forces of the Japanese Navy have to fight it out. And Nimitz is intent on achieving a victory so that he can seize the initiative. And so many forces are pushed south, thrown into the fighting off Guadalcanal, really extending logistically the capabilities of the United States Navy and the Allied forces. And they win, I think, in large part because of that recognition. They're trying to achieve that victory that gives them the initiative.
I guess linked to that, would you kind of include maybe the committing of Washington and South Dakota in a night action?
Yeah, I would. I think that is indicative of how the campaign was being viewed by Admiral Halsey, Admiral Nimitz, and others, right? Because there's no precedent for sending American battleships into a night action with such a small screen every time that, maybe not every time, but quite often in exercises before the war, the threat of night battle to battleships had been highlighted. And there are records where in after exercise reviews they're talking about how dangerous it is. You could get close to a destroyer, and the upper works, the bridge and other things of a battleship could get raked by not just 5-inch guns, but even smaller weapons, knocking out control capabilities and killing people and the rest. And so this is known to be dangerous. And the fact that they were willing to do that, to me, is indicative of how important they felt it was to maintain the ability of Henderson Field to fly off planes and fight off Japanese attempts to land more troops and supplies on the island. Uh, Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think it contrasts well with, and this is hardly an original observation, but the Japanese don't commit their anything larger than their Kongo class, um, which again pre-war had already been factored into night engagements, but they don't. They decide not to commit anything larger than that, um, and therefore, I mean, the U.S. they're throwing everything and the kitchen sink into these actions. Well, as the Japanese Navy is holding back continuously. Now, there's other considerations, there's fuel considerations and all that, though. I mean, to that kind of thing, I would counter. Then why are you fighting this protracted, decisive action where you can't bring your full strength to bear? Um, but
Yes, an important question.
um, but yeah, I think that is it kind of reveals that the U.S. Navy wanted to win this really, really, really bad, and they recognized and that they committed everything they could to achieve that goal. So, I guess moving into 1943, and this is where I think my view is that 1943 in the Pacific is almost criminally underwritten.
Mm.
So it was wonderful getting like a big chapter in your book on it. Because there's no major big, sexy surface actions between dozens of carriers and battleships, and so therefore it kind of gets skipped over a little bit. And in fact, there's actually a series of night actions fought up and down the Solomons during 1943 that are very important. They're just smaller in scale. And I'm wondering just how was the U.S. Navy kind of dealing with these actions? Did their approach to night actions radically change from their understanding as it stood at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign?
Eventually, it does, but it takes a while. So the tactics that Kincaid developed before Tassafaronga are seen as effective. They're used as a model going forward, and I think largely the failure at Tassafaronga is attributed to how Wright handled the force. Maybe not on him directly, but the circumstances of that action rather than the plan that informed the fight. And so the forces that um, Admiral Halsey sends up the Solomons to try to do battle with the Japanese, employ similar approaches, at least up through the middle of 1943. They're cruiser-centric formations. They have destroyer escorts. The destroyers seek to use their torpedoes, but usually what happens is the battle focuses around, at least from the American side, efforts to use um, primarily 6-inch gunned cruisers now um, to destroy formations that are dominated by Japanese destroyers. And it's a contest of American rapid fire 6-inch guns against Japanese torpedoes. And it doesn't go terribly well for the Americans. They get better at understanding what's happening in terms of the evolution of the battle. You know, CICs are being developed. SG radars become commonplace. But a lot of the challenges that we're seeing off Guadalcanal in terms of tracking targets with FC radars, losing them in a sea of shell splashes continue. And one of the things that it takes a while to move away from, these 6-inch gun cruisers can fire very rapidly, right? So like Helena, the cruiser has 15 of these guns, and they can each fire a couple times a minute. And so the before the war at night, before there was radar assisted fire control, these ships would have fired salvo fire at night to make it easier for spotting. In the daylight, they were encouraged to fire continuously. So as soon as every gun is ready, it fires because it was much easier to see the target. When radar is introduced, the United States Navy thinks, well, we can employ these daylight tactics or daylight approaches to firing the guns at night because the radar allows us to see the target. And that makes it just that much easier to lose a target in the shell splashes. So what happens very frequently is, before the shooting starts, most of the American cruisers are tracking the same target, the one with the largest or best radar return. They all open fire on it. That ship is unfortunate and often either severely damaged or sunk. And then after that, they hit hardly anything. Um, the Japanese sight the cruisers from their shell splashes, or sorry, from the flashes of their guns, and loose their torpedoes and get away. And sometimes they come back for another round and damage more. And so the United States Navy is continuing to adapt and evolve its tactics. But in large part, I think the Japanese approach is superior. And this is where a lot of commentators, I think, have reinforced the argument that the U.S. Navy was ill prepared. And it takes until the Navy is willing to loose its destroyers and employ more distributed formations, the tactics of Arleigh Burke, where one destroyer group approaches stealthily to the target, launches torpedoes, while the other hangs back and is prepared to cover it with gunfire. It takes until that shift for the Navy to really be able to gain the upper hand. And a key part of that is going back to a very early idea that destroyers are a weapon of stealth, and they're going to use their torpedoes first, not their guns. And so relearning something that Sims would have known in 1915, I think is really interesting.
I guess kind of linked to this, and we probably won't spend tons of time on this in this video, but again, Trent has appeared on the channel before, and he talked for like 45 minutes about CICs. Um, but obviously, the development of the CIC is really important for kind of pushing the U.S. Navy kind of past the Japanese Navy in night actions. And I mean, generally, I mean, CIC is huge. I come from an intelligence history background, and it is kind of one of those truisms that a lot of the time things that will be called quote unquote intelligence failures, it usually comes more on the analysis side or on the systems being overwhelmed by so much information that they can't actually figure out what matters and what is just noise, as they call it. And there's like kind of a similar aspect at play with in modern naval combat now with radar and both, and it's a fully three-dimensional um, battle area, and things are happening so fast. You can't necessarily, particularly night action, you can't necessarily trust your eyes. You can't just look out of your bridge and figure out immediately what's going on. And the CIC presumably plays a very significant role in all of this.
Absolutely. It's what I'm really glad that you emphasize that so much, that this sort of ability to make sense of what's going on, separate signal from noise, because that's one of the most important functions of the CIC. Is it does that. um, there's a lot of noise that's visible in action reports and other accounts of the Guadalcanal fighting. Some of that is still there in the 43 battles, but it changes. It's different. The U.S. Navy is getting better at understanding what's going on, making sense of these actions, not just while they're taking place, but also afterwards. And the CIC is critical to that. And one of the things that I think is really valuable about that story is a lot of us tend to think that, well, technology can solve problems. And what I like about the arc of U.S. Navy radars and then the Combat Information Center is the technology radar doesn't solve problems by itself. It needs new forms of organization to allow that. And that new form of organization allows new tactical forms, new tactical capabilities. I mentioned Burke a few minutes ago, and you couldn't. I don't think that the U.S. Navy could have adopted the tactics that he um, promoted without an effective CIC. Because if you're going to remain stealthy and hidden, and operate two distributed destroyer formations in a coordinated way, they have to be able to, you have to know where the other formation is. You have to try to avoid friendly fire. You have to sort of be patient and wait for the action to develop. And without an ability to make sense of where the other destroyer group is, that is difficult, if not impossible. And so, Vela Gulf is the first time that these tactics are really employed. Burke doesn't use them, but he influenced the use of them. Mooseburger takes them into command or into battle, and it works extremely well. The Japanese are surprised once again. The importance of surprise, and defeated. And then that begins, or it establishes a pattern, I think, as you were alluding to, of how the Combat Information Center begins to allow this capability, this cohesion amongst the U.S. Navy forces that the Japanese are unable to match.
Yeah, this is, I think the CIC chapter is one of the most fascinating in the book. Not the whole book is interesting. um, yeah, just because of my intelligence background, like seeing certain rough parallels. For example, the dawn of modern signals intelligence, which is usually pegged at about 1914, and then develops through the First World War, and it's almost something of a revolution, and it would continue on through the interwar period. And it's just suddenly people are using radios, and not only do you need to be able to try and break into their crypto systems or radio communications or whatever else, but then when you do, you get an almost incomprehensible amount of information all at once, constantly. And so, kind of, there was a technological problem, breaking into, say, Japan's crypto systems for, the diplomatic code or the combined fleet's operational code. But then you also have to figure out how to rapidly kind of synthesize this information and then disseminate it out to the people that need to know fast enough to act. Um, and that's arguably at least, I mean, it's at least as important, possibly more important than the original act of breaking into the communications in the first place. Because if you just do that and then you have no system in place to make proper use of this information, then you might as well not have it. It's just a big pile of, and I've looked at some of the radio intercepts, and it's just like like thousands and thousands of cards, and a lot of them are just like, here's a weather report for such and such island garrison, and it's just all noise. You have to sift through all of that, and it's kind of gets lost in people when they read like a narrative history of the war. It's just, oh well, they're going to attack Midway. Well, yeah, that information was kind of buried in there among a giant pile of incomprehensible garbage. Um, and the CIC, in my view, is kind of doing that the same thing, kind of just at the all the way down to the tactical level, is they're making sense of just of what otherwise a single captain standing on the bridge of his ship looking out with binoculars might not be able to comprehend and then act on in an intelligent way fast enough.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is a wonderful analogy. And I was chuckling a little bit. I'm not sure if it came through the microphone when you were talking about the code breaking and how difficult all that is. I think unless you've gotten close enough to that history and seen some of the messages or some of the intelligence reports, it's very easy to have this rosy view that, oh yeah, they figured out AF it was Midway and that was pretty much it. And no, there's so much work behind making sense of what was going on from all the material that they had. Um, and it's amazing the amount of effort that goes into that, and how easy it is for us to assume, oh yeah, well that was just simple. You break the code and that's it. No, no, much bigger problem.
Yeah, and I work directly with intelligence assessments from before the war, and it's always kind of amusing when I'll see somebody say it's oh this one report was accurate and therefore they knew. Well, to find that one accurate report that somebody posted on the internet, like they went through like 45 boxes of stuff, and out of that, there were 20 reports that said something wrong about the same subject. So, what do you believe if you don't have any benefit of hindsight? Do you believe this one
Mhm.
report that seems to be the weird outlier? I mean, we believe it because in hindsight, we know that's the right one, but there's a lot more going on.
Right, and all the bias that would come into it at the time as well. One of the things that fascinates me, kind of tangentially related to that, is how many times different sighting reports claimed that German airplanes were flying over the Dutch East Indies or Java or someplace like that because, well, there's an assumption that Japanese aircraft or Japanese pilots couldn't be as talented as what they were seeing or experiencing. And it's head scratching almost, the amount of to someone now reading that, but those biases were there, and they were coloring how people were interpreting facts and observations. It's very interesting.
So to kind of bring things back, so the Battle of Vella La Vella in October 1943, that's kind of regarded as the last Japanese naval surface victory of the war. I've seen statements that were broader than that last Japanese victory of the war, which is technically not the case, but um, it was definitely the last naval surface action that they won. I mean, it was hardly a one-sided you know slaughter or anything of that sort. It was they accomplished their objective. They lost a destroyer. The U.S. lost, I think, one destroyer and a couple damaged. But that was kind of the last, kind of the Japanese Navy, at least the surface force, kind of went out with a little whimper there. Um, so from then on, it's pretty much just American naval victories. They're hard fought, but they are American naval victories. Some, like Philippine Sea, is quite one sided, and Leyte Gulf as well. So most relevant for this discussion, I guess, would be Surigao Strait. Although before that, and I had no idea that this was a thing, but it's absolutely fascinating, is the Battle of the Pips. And if we want to get into that a little bit.
Yeah, there was books sometimes have to meet certain requirements, and there were a number of things that I had to cut out of learning war to make the size. I think it made the argument better, but there were certain details that I wish I could have included, and one was more about the pips. So this is fought in the Aleutians in 1943, and not much is written about it because it wasn't really a battle at all. There weren't any Japanese forces there, but an American formation does what I think it foreshadows Surigao in a way, in that it takes some of the best of what had been learned about night combat in the war with some of the tactical approaches and forms that existed before the war. So the formation that fights the Battle of the Pips uh, is a mixed group with battleships in the center and cruisers and destroyers, and they begin to use forms from Pac-10. They open fire in radar control. They're going to make a destroyer torpedo attack, all against a whole series of radar returns that, to them, look very much like Japanese ships. They're maneuvering. They appear to be zigzagging. They do things to try to make sure that they're not, just getting a radar return through some weird atmospheric sensor that might be an island hundreds of miles away. So there was something there. The best research that I've seen suggests that it was a bunch of seabirds that nest on the or sleep on the surface of the ocean and then take off at certain periods. Evidently, those who fish these waters have detected that the same kind of a thing. So for quite a while, the United States Navy lobbed armor-piercing shells at seabirds, um, but they were using the Combat Information Center to create a tactical approach that used destroyers, cruisers, and battleships in an integrated way, much as they assumed they were going to be able to do in daylight before the war. And this is exactly what happens at Surigao. Now, these are the older battleships, so they're primarily doing bombardment missions at this time. But Oldendorf, who is commanding the group, does the same basic thing. He uses patterns from Pac-10, issues those to his group, so he gets them on the same page relatively quickly, and then positions a battle line with cruisers on either flank at the top of the strait, and basically waits for the Japanese to come to him. But he's not going to wait entirely passively. Destroyer attack groups are sent down the strait, and these attack groups work very much like, in a way that I think Sims probably would have recognized. Right? They try to be stealthy, at least at first, fire their torpedoes. Some of them employ their guns afterwards, and those attacks do the bulk of the damage to the initial Japanese formation, sinking one of the battleships. I gather there's still some uncertainty about which one was sunk first, and then essentially eliminating the destroyer screen that is at the front of the Japanese formation through torpedoes and then gunfire. And so by the time the surviving Japanese ships reach the battle line, there's only one battleship, a cruiser, and I think a destroyer left, and the battleship is destroyed. So it's a night battle, but with the CIC and the other things that have changed over the preceding years and months, the U.S. Navy brings to it this concept of, well, we'll fight it very much like we intended to fight a daylight battle, because that's how capable we are now of making sense of what's going on at night. And the Japanese don't have a comparable capability.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating way of framing it. Like I'd never thought of it that way because yeah, of course, like they're using all these battleships at night, which normally, like by pre-war thinking, that's not what you do. But they do it, and they do it remarkably successfully. Because I think the only on the Japanese side, they very briefly entertained the ideal of twilight decisive battle, but even the Japanese threw it out as not viable at that time. It was like in the mid 1930s, and they
Mm-hmm.
never really revisited it, and they never got the capability that was demonstrated by the U.S. Navy at Surigao Strait.
Yeah. Now, one thing that is worth adding there is the capabilities are enhanced not just by having the Combat Information Center and these new plans, but also the fire control radars have become more sophisticated. Ships at Surigao, or at least some of the battleships and the cruisers, have what is now the Mark 8 surface fire control radar, which is far in advance of what the old FC or Mark III could do, both in terms of its visual display, it has a different scope, and in terms of its resolution. And so if you dig into the details of Surigao, ships that have the Mark 8, like the West Virginia, have a much better sense of how to track and then fire at the Japanese ships compared to some of the other battleships who still have a Mark III or FC radar. And some of them don't even get on the target. They cannot develop an effective solution and don't really know where to shoot.
So I guess to try and wrap up, what does the U.S. Navy's experience with night fighting, kind of from all the way back to before the First World War, through the interwar period to the kind of desperate actions off Guadalcanal, and then for fast forwarding all the way through to kind of the crushing victory over the Japanese, the Surigao Strait. What does that say about the U.S. Navy as a learning organization in this period?
I'm really glad that you chose to focus us on night fighting because I think this is a really great lens for understanding learning in the U.S. Navy during this period and evolution. And I use that word deliberately because I think while what happened over the course of the Guadalcanal battles is definitely an adaptation, some learning from one battle to the next, adopting new tactical forms. Evolution makes more sense when we look at the whole of World War II and also the tracing it back farther in terms of the U.S. Navy's approach to night fighting, because there's initially these experiments of how do we fight with destroyers, how do we attack a modern battleship formation at night, because that's the only way to get close enough to them to have an effect, through the interwar period where the Navy is exploring, well, we need to protect the battleships. That brings in a more sophisticated screen. To break through the screen, we have to do certain things. And so these patterns sort of emerge and then fade away, and some of them come back based on the technologies of the time, the ship types that are in play, and then specific approaches that are going to be used. The Guadalcanal fights show that a lot of the interwar assumptions are wrong. Right, we're not going to do a lot of fighting of screen formations, attacking your way through a screen, or trying to use guns first. If there isn't a screen, is a bad idea, particularly for a destroyer. We need to make sure that we leverage surprise as much as possible. Surprise is extremely influential. So let's use radar. Let's use the Combat Information Center to have more distributed forms. Let's leverage surprise as much as possible. Let's continue to use destroyers as a weapon of stealth. And then what you get to at the end through these new capabilities with the Combat Information Center, PAC-10, and other things is an approach like we were talking about at Surigao, where it's let's use the effective approaches we've been rehearsing for so long that work in daylight at night, because now we can use them at night. And so this arc shows how the Navy was willing to explore different approaches, experiment with them, bring them in, embrace the ones that work, ultimately discard ones that don't work so well, um, and get through some of these mistaken assumptions relatively quickly. To me, that's one of the key things about the fights of the first year of the Second World War, which is essentially from Pearl Harbor through Guadalcanal, is the Navy is learning quickly. It's exposing what doesn't work. We've talked about night combat, but the same kinds of things are happening with aircraft carriers and how to use them, and then in other patterns like with logistics. And then that learning is what gets integrated into new approaches that the Navy employs over the remainder of the war. And I think it's a very important and interesting story. So thank you for creating some time for us to talk about it.
Yeah, and thank you for being willing to talk about it. I guess so. So one thing I'll note is I don't know if because I know Bernhard got a review copy of Learning War and he might have to put a disclaimer up even though I'm the one talking. But I want to make it clear for those who are listening that I bought my own copy. Damn it! So I'm going to gush about it. It is a book well worth reading. Um, and it provides a unique perspective because of Trent's kind of blend of expertise. So it's not only a history of a facet of the United States Navy, but it's also looking at it from a perspective that a lot of other historians might not be able to look at it, like as the United States Navy as a learning organization, which I think is well, I mean, it's literally in the title of the book, but that's really where the book shines in laying out this. It makes me wish that there was like a book like it on the Japanese Navy during the war or something like that. Maybe one day it will be written, not by me because my Japanese is terrible, but um, yeah, it's well worth picking up. I got through it really, really fast. It reads well. It has my one of my favorite things in books, which is like subheaders within chapters, so I can quickly reference it, which is, I mean, it's such a small thing, but oh man, I love it when I see books that have that. Anyway, so thank you very much, Trent, and I hope everyone else enjoyed this video as well. Again, I think I plugged it a couple times, but there was another chat with Trent if you want to know more about the CIC. Bernhard can link it. I'm sure he's probably already linked it through this video at numerous points. That video is it's almost criminally underviewed. It's very
Oh
interesting,
no.
so go check it out.
Well,
uh,
thank you, and thank you for all those kind words about the book. I really appreciate that note about subheadings. I was using those not just to make it easier for people who are reading it, but also to help me make sense of what I was doing. So they serve a dual purpose.
yeah, it's kind of this is an slightly off-topic discussion, but I know Bernhard is very passionate about book structure as well. Um, and it's just it makes me far more likely to cite the book. Like some of the
Hmm.
books, even books that are extremely good, I always think of like At Dawn We Slept by Gordon Prang. It's a huge book. It's wonderful. Uh, Trying to find things in it to reference is a nightmare because it's got
Hmm.
my two pet peeves, which is out of context quotes as chapter headers. So you
Yeah.
don't know what the chapter's about, and then it has no subheaders or anything like that, so you can't find where certain themes are in the book. And it's fine if you want to read if you're reading a book narrative history, you're just going through it, totally fine. This is just like my little thing. I love subheaders. Anyway, with that bizarre tangent, we can we can end the discussion. So see you all next time. Thank you.